All right, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going deep into your brain. Well, not literally, of course. We're looking at the super cool study that's all about mapping the energy powerhouses of your brain cells, mitochondria. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you want more content like this.
Mitochondria, yeah, they're like tiny batteries, keeping everything running smoothly up there. And when those batteries start to fizzle out, well, that's when things can go wrong, really wrong. I mean, you're talking Alzheimer's, depression, a whole slew of neurological issues.
Exactly. I mean, it's pretty clear why figuring out how these mitochondria are spread out in the brain and like how they differ in different areas is kind of a big deal.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's basic but fundamental to really understanding how the brain works in sickness and in health, right?
Right. So these researchers came up with a pretty ingenious way to tackle this. They took, half a frozen human brain and sliced it up into these tiny little cubes called voxels.
Oh, hold on. So they really went all out with the brain slicing.
Oh, yeah. They were very precise. And get this. Each voxel was just 3 millimeters cubed. That's tiny.
3 millimeters, so about the size of, I don't know, a grain of rice, maybe.
Yeah, something like that. And here's the thing. That size, those 3 millimeter voxels, it's close to the resolution we get from MRI scans.
Okay, so they're linking the microscopic to the macroscopic, essentially.
Exactly. That's what makes this so cool. They're connecting what's happening at the cellular level to what we can see with brain imaging in living people.
Bridging the gap, huh? That's pretty powerful stuff. So what kind of things were they looking at in each of these mini brain cubes?
Okay, so they didn't just look at one thing. They went all out, measured a bunch of different mitochondrial characteristics, like how active the enzymes were that produce energy, how many mitochondria were in each voxel, and get this, the overall respiratory capacity.
Hold on, respiratory capacity. What does that even mean in the context of a tiny brain cell battery?
Essentially, it's like measuring how much power each mitochondrion can generate. Ah, okay, so horsepower for mitochondria, I like it. So what did they find? Did different parts of the brain have different mitochondrial horsepower?
Oh, yeah. One of the first things they looked at was the difference between gray matter and white matter.
Okay, gray matter, white matter. Refresh my memory.
So gray matter, that's where all the neurons are, those brain cells that process information. And white matter, that's mostly made up of the long fibers connecting different parts of the brain.
Ah, got it. The processing centers versus the communication highways. So did they find a difference?
Oh, yeah, a big one. Gray matter has way more mitochondria than white matter, over 50% more.
Makes sense, right. I mean, gray matter's got to be working overtime, processing all that information, needs a lot of juice to keep going.
Exactly. And what's even cooler is that the mitochondria in gray matter weren't just more numerous. They were also better at producing energy, especially in those parts of the cortex, the outer layer of the brain. That evolved more recently.
Wait, so newer parts of the brain have souped up mitochondria? Seems like it. And it wasn't just one measurement, it was across the board. All those mitochondrial metrics, gray matter, came out on top.
Wow. So it's not just a numbers game, it's quality over quantity too. I mean, that really emphasizes how different these brain tissues are in terms of their energy needs.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Now, remember that mitochondrial respiratory capacity, or MRC, we talked about? Well, they found variation in that too. Not just between gray and white matter, but across specific brain structures.
So some parts of the brain have mitochondria that are just better at generating power than others. Interesting.
Yep. And the white matter consistently had the lowest MRC, which means those mitochondria aren't as specialized for intense energy production.
Okay, so that makes sense. The white matter is mostly about transmitting signals, not processing tons of information.
Exactly. It's like comparing a high-performance sports car to a reliable, fuel-efficient family sedan. Both have their roles, right?
Absolutely. So besides comparing gray and white matter, did they look at specific brain regions?
Yeah, they went even deeper. They used this cool technique called UMAP analysis.
UMAP. What's that? Some kind of brain mapping GPS?
Kind of. Think of it like this. They took all those measurements from the 703 voxels and created a sort of map where brain areas with similar mitochondrial profiles are clustered together.
Ah, so it helps visualize patterns in a ton of data. Makes sense. And did anything interesting pop out on this map?
Oh, yeah. First, it confirmed that the biggest difference was between gray and white matter, just like we saw before. But then they zoomed in on the gray matter and found 4 distinct clusters based on their mitochondrial activity.
So even within gray matter, there's variation, different mitochondrial personalities, you could say.
Exactly. And they noticed a trend. The cortical areas, those outer layers of the brain involved in higher level thinking,
Yeah.
they tended to have higher respiratory capacity and MRC.
So those newer brain regions, they're not just packed with mitochondria, they've got the high-performance models too.
Right, but there was this one exception, a real outlier, the putamen.
Kudaman, huh? What's that one do again?
It's involved in motor control, movement, and learning. And it had the highest respiratory capacity and mitochondrial density out of all the gray matter regions.
Whoa, so it's like the powerhouse of movement and learning.
Seems like it. The researchers think it might be because it has so many synapses and nerve fibers passing through it, including those related to dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter.
Interesting. So maybe like those areas that need a ton of energy, they just evolved to have more and better mitochondria.
That's what the data suggests. They found that brain regions that evolved more recently, like those in humans and primates, generally have higher MRC values.
So it's like as the brain evolved and became more complex, it needed more energy. And that drove the evolution of more efficient mitochondria.
Makes sense, right? It's fascinating to think about how energy demands shape the evolution of our brains.
Absolutely. It's like the need for power literally sculpted our brains over millions of years.
Okay, so we've talked about gray matter versus white matter and regional differences. But what about the specific types of cells within these brain regions? Do their mitochondria differ too?
That's the next frontier, but it gets really complex. They did some initial investigations using this technique called single nucleus RNA sequencing, or snRNA-seq.
Single nucleus RNA sequencing. Sounds pretty high tech.
It is. It lets them look at the genes being expressed in individual cell nuclei, which gives you clues about what's going on inside different cell types.
So what did they find? Any hints of cell type specific mitochondria?
Well, first, it confirmed that different brain areas have different mixes of cell types, which we already knew. But then when they looked at gene expression related to mitochondria, they found something interesting.
What was that?
The white matter had lower expression of genes related to mitochondria compared to gray matter. And that lines up with what they found in the biochemical measurements, right? Less mitochondria, less activity.
Makes sense. So did they look at specific genes related to energy production?
Yeah, they focused on the genes for the OXPHOS complexes. Those are the protein complexes that carry out oxidative phosphorylation, the main energy-producing process in mitochondria.
Okay, and did the gene expression match up with what they saw in the enzyme activity measurements?
In some areas, like the putamen, hippocampus, and white matter, yeah, there was a decent correlation. But in the cortex, it was a bit off. Some of the genes were expressed at lower levels than you'd expect based on the activity measurements.
So sometimes gene expression doesn't perfectly predict what's happening at the protein level. Biology is complicated.
Right, it's not a one-to-one relationship. But here's the thing. Even though different cell types might have their own mitochondrial quirks, the overall environment, the brain region itself, seemed to have a big influence.
So the neighborhood matters, even for mitochondria.
Yeah, it's like a local adaptation thing. They found some hints of cell type specific mitochondrial profiles. For example, inhibitory neurons, those that dampen brain activity, tended to have lower expression of those OXPHOS genes. And endothelial cells, the ones lining blood vessels, had higher expression.
Interesting. So each cell type has its own energy strategy, but it's also influenced by the overall energy demands of the brain region it's in.
Exactly. It's like a delicate balance between intrinsic properties and environmental pressures.
Okay, this whole mitochondrial mapping thing is amazing, but it requires dissecting a brain. Is there any way to get this kind of information non-invasively?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And that's where the connection to MRI comes in.
So you're saying we could potentially see this mitochondrial landscape with brain imaging?
Potentially, yes. They took the data they gathered from the brain tissue and compared it to standard MRI data from a bunch of healthy adults.
And could they predict mitochondrial characteristics based on the MRI?
Yeah, they built some statistical models, and it turns out they could predict things like mitochondrial density and OXPHOS activity in brain regions they hadn't even directly measured. The accuracy was decent, not perfect, but promising.
Wow, so we might be able to see the brain's energy landscape without cutting it open.
It's still early days, but the possibility is definitely there. And when they grouped the voxels into broader brain regions, those predictions became even more accurate.
That makes sense given the strong regional differences we've been talking about.
Absolutely. And they even used their model to generate whole brain maps of estimated mitochondrial density and activity at high resolution. And guess what? Those maps showed the same regional specialization they found in the tissue measurements.
Amazing. So this research is not just telling us about the brain's energy landscape, it's also pointing towards a way to see it non-invasively.
Exactly. It's like opening a new window into the brain.
So to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways?
Well, the big one is that the human brain has incredible mitochondrial diversity, both regionally and at the cellular level. And this diversity seems to be linked to both brain structure and evolutionary history.
And this isn't just abstract science, right? This has real-world implications for understanding how our brains work, what goes wrong in disease, and maybe even how to diagnose and treat those diseases in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Energy is fundamental to everything the brain does. So variations in this mitochondrial landscape could contribute to individual differences in cognitive abilities, susceptibility to diseases, even our subjective experiences. It's a whole new way of thinking about what makes us who we are.
Mind-blowing stuff. So for you, the listener, keep in mind that those tiny powerhouses inside your brain cells, they're not all the same. They're a diverse bunch, working hard to keep your brain humming along. And as this research shows, understanding their secrets could unlock a whole new level of understanding about ourselves and how our brains work.
It's like a new frontier of brain research. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of what we can learn from this mitochondrial map.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you want more content like this.